So we've been discussing my microphone choices when I've been recording on my Baltic Jazz sessions, and here's MÆVEY, one of the artists featured on the Baltic Jazz recordings. So we're going to discuss the process, because it's all very well having a great mic, but one of the things I think is really important is the recording environment, and that starts with a really good balance of the song. It can be a totally different balance to the balance I'm listening to. And in my setup, I've got a mixing console here which has the monitoring as I would like to hear the mix, because I try and mix as I go so that I'm hearing the balance with the reverbs I might want, any delays. But the artist maybe wants a totally different headphone mix, especially reverbs. I mean, reverbs, don't you find, can often be very, very off-putting if they're too much or too little?
If it's too much or too little, and it's definitely, there is a middle ground where it's perfect. But I feel, I mean, I'm probably, other artists have different preferences, but I love to have quite have a heavy, like, hear my voice quite clearly in the cans, whereas I'm sure other people are more interested in hearing how the voice is blending into the track. But I'm very much of like wanting to hear what my voice is sounding like as we're recording it, which obviously is, as Steve said, it's not always what is happening in the control room. It's happening in my cans. It's a different thing.
And it also depends whether you're doing lead vocal or backing vocals.
Absolutely.
So when we're doing backing vocals, very often the balance might be biased towards perhaps the Rhodes that's doing the chords or something, because when you're doing the harmonies, particularly if we're doing oohs and ahs, you want that to replicate the keyboard shape, don't you, to some degree?
Absolutely.
So that balance, so again, that's a very handy hint for those that may be working at home. If you've only got a small interface, maybe you can use a second output and drive a headphone out from that, so you can give your singer a very different balance to the one that you're listening to, because it can make a huge difference in the performance.
Absolutely, absolutely. I found that, you know, when we first started working together, we really did experiment with finding the perfect mic for the voice, which I found really, really fascinating, because you do just assume, oh, this mic, kind of one mic fits all, which is absolutely not the case. And so when we kind of experimented, we like really felt a microphone really suit a voice, and that can really suit the lead vocal and not necessarily be the mic that you use for backing vocals, if you're lucky enough to have more than one mic in your...
No, that's right. You've just reminded me, on Futuristic, for example, the track that we recently released, the oohs and ahs that are on there are sampled. We sampled your voice multiple times, and then I edited the vocals so they had this particular sound. But we did use a different microphone on that, because we were trying to get not a synthetic sound, but we wanted a sound that was going to sit very differently from the lead vocal. So the lead vocal, we used the Audio-Technica 4060 because we wanted that kind of warmer sound. But for the backing vocals, I think we used the 87, if I remember, because we just wanted a very plain sound, but we wanted to be able to EQ it. And I did also, in the processing of that, we recorded, I think it was 6 parts individually, but then when I mixed them together, I kept EQing them as we went. So it had a distant sound. You know, it would sit back from the track. It was a trick years and years ago when track counts were limited. Very often a producer, and myself included, we'd mix the vocals. We used to have Dolby in those days, so we'd mix the vocals, but we'd pull the Dolby out, which gives it that sound. It's a really great sound, which you can do with EQ today, but that's kind of what we were going for. And when you listen to those, the way they come in, they sound really great in the track.
And especially it's because on Futuristic, it's just my voice doing the backing vocals, and we have Marco doing some vocoder kind of, but actually when you just have, you know, when the lead vocal is just doing
one person,
when it's one person, you sometimes, it can be that voice in the BVs as well as the lead vocal, it can get muddy. So like having the different tricks with the microphone really separates that sound and kind of lets the lead vocal shine whilst padding with a delicious kind of BVs.
While we're on the subject of that, not just about the EQ, but I really remember also microphone position, as in my studio's medium dry. It's not super dry, but it's certainly not ambient. And so we can use a small amount of that space so that on some vocals, the Christmas one as an example, where you were literally a millimetre from the microphone with a blanket over your head, versus some of the others where you've been several feet back from the microphones. But one of the other tricks I've used in the mix on both Futuristic and So Glad is this new plugin. It's a reverb plugin with a difference, and it's made by Isotope. It's called Aura, and it's it's very hard to describe what it actually does, but it's reverb, but not like you know it, because it's sort of, it works on a frequency separation, so it doesn't cloud the reverb. I guess a similar trick that we used to use a long time ago was having reverb triggered with a gate, so that when the singer was there, you had a certain amount of reverb. When the singer's long notes were there, the reverb tailed with it because you'd be following the gate. I guess a trick like guitarists use when they have their delay pedals, they tend to have the delay much quieter when the notes are live, and then as they stop playing, the delay comes. So this reverb does a sort of vocal equivalent of that. If there's a lot going on, it tails it back so it doesn't cloud the vocal. But then when you have a gap or a less dynamic vocal, it swells it back up again. It's quite an interesting sound. It's one of those things in the mix, you can turn it off and you go, oh, that sounds different. Turn it back and you go, oh, that sounds great. But you can't really, it's sort of an invisible thing. I love it.
That is a Steve Levine trick right there. So
do check out that plug. It's quite new.
Isotope.
By Isotope. Yeah, or they do a delay as well, which I've just started using, but that plugin is particularly good. It's an interesting, again, with plugins on vocals, do experiment, because even the stock stuff that you've got on Logic, you can do some incredible things. In fact, actually, Logic now have the Contec reverb, which years and years ago I actually had a actual hardware unit, which I remember was like $3,000 in the 80s. It was so expensive and it used to get so hot, and I used that a lot on many Culture Club vocals. So the Contec reverb is now free within Logic. It's fantastic.
Well, speaking of Culture Club then, what microphone did you use for Boy George, or did you use different microphones throughout that process?
Well, in the very beginning, as I didn't have any money and didn't have any microphones, most of the vocals are an 87 on the early recordings, because the studios often had an 87.
Yeah, nice.
87 is the go-to mic. The first microphone that I purchased to use with George was the AKG Tube, which I'd mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Now, the AKG Tube was a reproduction at the time of the AKG C12. It was a nice mic, and I've used it on some of George's vocals, but for me, it never totally suited his voice. And it wasn't until I changed later to a Sanken microphone that I realized that was the tone. And I think George, even today, prefers to use those type of microphones, those very high quality mics. He's got two tones in his voice. That sort of breathy, high quality, but then as he's got older, he's got this richer tone in his voice. I've recorded him quite recently, and I've used just my modern mics, and it's interesting how his voice has changed over the years, but also how the microphones do have a certain color. So most of the big hits were 87, and then as we moved later on, it was a combination of the AKG Tube and then the Sanken. And the Sanken is unique because it has two caps. So I still have my Sanken, but I don't have my AKG Tube anymore.
And is there a microphone that you like? You've got a vast collection of microphones. Is there any one that you haven't got that you'd like to have?
Well, I regret selling a set of Sony microphones that I had. I had the now very collectible Sony microphones. In truth, I never used them a lot, and I had the set that had the two, I think they're C38s, they're really desirable, but I also had the little drum microphones. And I remember doing a drum session, and the drummer hit the microphone and bent it. No. And I don't have OCD, but I really don't like my stuff being damaged. And when I looked at it in the back, I kept looking at it thinking, oh no, So I kind of fell out of love with all of them at that point.
Fair enough.
And then I remember there was a guy came to my studio and he wanted them, and he said, I really would love to have those. I'll buy them off of you. And I actually was in the process of upgrading some other bits of equipment. I said, oh yeah, I don't use them very much now. I've kind of learned that lesson. You have to be really careful with equipment, because I've got stuff in my rack I haven't used for ages, but then there's one session that you suddenly want to turn on and think, I'm so glad I've kept it. You know, so you have to be careful of what you sell and what you keep. But of course, a producer always wants to buy new things. There's always the next greatest thing that comes out. And there are actually some fantastic new developments with microphones. I'm very excited by Universal Audio's new range of microphones. I've got a couple of those, and they are absolutely fantastic and incredibly creative. back to Futuristic, if you remember, when Sarah did the saxophone on that, we used one of those microphones on her saxophone.
Yeah.
And what was so great in the mix was we were able to blend the microphone sound with Marco's synth patches.
Absolutely.
And change the colour of the microphone in the mix. And it really did make a difference because she did tenor, alto and baritone. So I had 3 tracks. And flute.
Yeah.
And blending, particularly the baritone, which is a big, thick sound, I was able to change the colour of that in the mix, something you couldn't have done a few years ago. So I'm so pleased as a producer to be able to have those tricks. So those UA mics are really, really fantastic. And I've just been using them on my drums, so the kick drum, I mean, you witnessed
Yeah, it's so good.
What a sound. It's possibly
so
my favourite kick sound.
When we were recording So Glad and Vidor came in and we set that mic up, didn't we? And we would just, and honestly, it changed. We just started hearing
And also, the other thing that's interesting on that track is if you listen to his fantastic tom-tom fills, the top tom used the other microphone that they have. And so essentially you've got the top tom with a universal audio mic and the kick drum with it. And the other thing that I added to the kick drum is I've just got one of those new kick port microphones, which is a sub. So we've got like the mic and the sub together. But it's a terrific sound, particularly as the song itself is a retro R&B vintagey kind of thing. And yet we've got a modern drum sound, but pays homage to the style.
Yeah. You should check out that video. That Steve did. It's a UA SD5, I think, is the kick drum. Is that right?
I think so. I'm terrible with these numbers because I've got my brain is full of model numbers.
For sure. But I think, you should link that so people can see. If
because it's like SD1, which is the one we use in the control room, and there's 3 and 5, I think. Of I'm terrible with numbers.
If we're wrong, we'll correct it, but I think it's the SD5.
Do check that. They're great mics. I guess the takeaways are, have conversations with the singers you're working with. Make sure they're comfortable with the headphone balance because really, unless you've got a comfortable session, you're never going to get a great vocal performance, regardless of whether you've got a £5 microphone or a £5,000 microphone. Getting the great performance is the key. Once you've got the great performance, you need to capture it in the best possible way that you think your track needs, whilst avoiding the technical pitfalls. Don't overdrive the channel unless that's what you want. Make sure the compressor isn't going too mad because you can't undo it. If the vocalist has a very sibilant sound, consider using a de-esser, which is another little trick. Maybe we'll do a whole Patreon about de-essing because that's quite an art, but it can make a big difference in the level of the vocal in the track. And then the reverbs, they're really important. The reverbs that you use when the singer's singing to get the best performance and the reverbs that you use on the mix. They may not be the same things, by the way. It's all about open conversations. If you're always open about the conversations with the artist you're working with, I think you'll get better results.
And vice versa from artist to producer as well, is to kind of have the confidence to say, this doesn't feel right in my cans. This doesn't, I'm not hearing myself properly. I'm not hearing the mix properly. You have to have the confidence to say that as well. It is, like you said, it's a conversation.
And be brave. If you're not feeling the vocal on that particular day, there's no point in doing 20 takes.
That was So Glad. We did a take, didn't we? We came in and we did a vocal take for So Glad. And even though it wasn't bad, you said to me, like, I think you can do better, which also is so kind of nice if you have someone to be like actually believe in you in that way. And so then I was like, you're right. I think we can do it better. And we came back in and we did it again. And it was like, that was great. That was great.
And it was another occasion. So you've got time between it. I think it's really important that you've got to feel healthy, in the right mood and in the right state of mind to perform the vocal, because that vocal lasts forever. And if you're just not feeling it that day for whatever reason, rather than doing 100 takes and then giving a producer a nightmare of trying to comp it. Because the final vocal when he came back the second day was 3 takes, wasn't it?
It was 3 takes.
And 99% of it is
one take. And then we just comped a couple of little bits. And you hear that on the track. You really do. You hear that it's kind of this, this performance and that it's, in that moment. It's
a good emotion. And as I mentioned in the other video, the vocals at the top of the song were done with that microphone and they were part of the songwriting session. We literally kept every single bit that we recorded. And the final mix is a combination of spur of the moment moments that are captured to quite intense, forensic parts of other parts. But, you know, I think that's what makes it a great track. I'm really proud of it. I think it sounds really good.
Me too. I love it.
That's your lot, everybody.
Thank
See you
so
soon.
much.
Well, thanks for watching. Hopefully you found these little tips and insights useful. Always remember, do experiment. Try different microphones. Sometimes the cheapest microphone in the world, placed really well through the perfect signal chain, can be just as good as a multi-thousand-pound microphone. So always experiment. And hopefully you found this useful. And see you next time on my Patreon channel.